Welcome, and thank you for joining today's conference overview of the draft guide for the regulatory status review process. Before we begin, please ensure you have opened the WebEx chat panel by using the associated icon located at the bottom right corner of your screen. Please note that all audio connections are muted at this time until the Q&A portion of the call. You may submit written questions throughout the presentation, and these will be addressed during the Q&A. To submit a written question, select all panelists from the drop-down menu in the chat panel, enter your question in the message box provided, and send. The instructions on how to ask verbal questions will be given at the time of the Q&A session. A copy of the presentation will be available on the BRS website. And if you require technical assistance, please send a chat to the event producer. And with that, I'll turn the conference over to Bernadette Juarez, Deputy Administrator. Please go ahead.
Thank you, and welcome everybody. We're so happy that you've been able to join us for the overview of the draft guide on the regulatory status review process. We apologize for the false start last week, and we're happy we were able to regroup actually in larger numbers today, so that's good news. As you know, we've posted the draft guide for the regulatory status review process on our website. It's been there for about a month at this point, and we think it's a great time to have Suma Chakravarthi and Abby Walter give you a walkthrough of the process. This is based on the draft guide, so of course things might change based on the comments that we receive from you. We hope to use this as an opportunity to respond to any questions that you might have that would help guide and refine your submissions to us. So we look forward to today's walkthrough and question and answer. And with that, I'll turn it over to Suma and Abby.
Thank you, Bernadette. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the webinar. Abigail Walter and I will provide an overview of the draft guide for the regulatory status review or RSR process in this presentation. Like Bernadette mentioned, we are currently collecting public comments on this, and therefore the draft guide may change in the future. Okay. So USDA-APHIS published revised regulations for the oversight of organisms developed using genetic engineering in May of last year under 7 CFR 340. And regulatory status review or RSR is described in 7 CFR part 340.4. We published the RSR guide for public comments some weeks ago to provide applicants guidance on how to submit an RSR request. In this webinar, we will provide you an overview of the process, both in terms of what you should submit and also how we will review that information to make our determination. Earlier this year in April, we started the process by accepting requests for 6 plant species: corn, cotton, soybean, potato, tomato, and alfalfa. These are the species for which we receive maximum permit applications and petitions and with which we are most familiar. So we launched the process with these species. On the 1st of October, that's this Friday, we will open up RSR to all plant species. RSR is only for plants, and the purpose of RSR is to determine whether a modified plant is subject to the regulations. It is not event specific. The regulations are product based. After an RSR, if APHIS determines that the plant is not subject to the regulations, then that plant trait mechanism of action or MOA combination will be posted to the APHIS website. Currently, our APHIS website does have this PT MOA table, and it shows what has been previously evaluated under the legacy petition process and deregulated. We will add to that to include plants which have been evaluated in the RSR or CR and found to be not subject to our regulations. These plants, in summary, have been previously reviewed and found unlikely to pose increased plant pest risk. And you're going to hear this often during our presentation. We encourage stakeholders to come in and talk to us prior to submission so that we can answer any questions and provide clarity on the different steps. Okay, next slide. During RSR, we review the plant's biological properties, the introduced trait, and MOA of the introduced trait. For RSR, we will also consider sexually compatible relatives of the plant that can receive the introduced trait via gene flow. RSR is a two-step process, of which the first is the initial review, where we will use problem formulation to identify plausible pathways to plant pest risk. For this, we will be guided by the risk equation as it pertains to plant pest risk that Abby will elaborate upon later in the talk. The analysis will focus on the introduced trait and how that may have an impact on the plant. Some RSRs may proceed to a second step, the plant pest risk assessment or PPRA step, where APHIS will evaluate any factor of concern identified in the initial review. The goal of PPRA is to determine the likelihood and consequence of plausible pathways to plant pest risk. Okay. This slide graphically depicts our process and the direction RSR may take based on outcomes at every step. When we receive a technically complete request, we will begin the initial review. At the end of the initial review, if there is no plausible pathway to plant pest risk, the plant is not subject to the regulations and the RSR is complete. However, if pathways are identified, APHIS will inform the developer who at that point can choose to ask us to proceed with a PPRA. We will conduct the PPRA based on scientific information available in the literature and information that the developer chooses to provide APHIS. More on this later in the talk. After the PPRA, if APHIS determines that the modified plant is unlikely to pose plant pest risk, the RSR is complete and the plant is not subject to the regulations. However, if APHIS is unable to reach that conclusion, the plant remains regulated and will come under permit. In the future, if the applicant informs APHIS of new scientifically valid information that can inform the PPRA, APHIS will redo the PPRA. This is called the re-review. Any person may request APHIS to perform re-review. During this process, during the time when APHIS is waiting for a response from a requester, at the end of initial review, before we begin a PPRA, RSR process remains paused. And just to mention, anytime, like during the time that a modified plant is going through RSR, the applicant can always move the plant under permit. This is just a reminder of the timeline for each step. The initial review will take 180 days to complete after a complete request is received. Technically complete request is received. The PPRA will take 15 months to complete from the time the initial request is received by APHIS. This timeline does not include any time when the process is paused by the requester. After the initial review, if APHIS determines that the plant is not subject to the regulations, the PT-MOA combination will be posted on our website. We will post preliminary PPRA for public comment as well as the final PPRA in the Federal Register. In the following slides, Abby will explain in some detail RSR with examples and requirements for submission. And with that, let me hand over to Abby.
Okay, thank you, Suma. So I'm going to talk first about how we do the analysis in the RSR. And I want to start by saying that the whole RSR analysis is really built around the risk equation, which I'm showing you here. So what this equation is saying is that the plant pest risk associated with a modified plant is the product of the exposure of valued endpoints to that plant, either directly or indirectly, and the adverse consequences that can be associated with that modified plant when it's present. Now, what this means is that if we think about a plant that might present plant pest risk by being an overwintering host for a pest or pathogen that could then go on to attack another crop, in order to realize the plant pest risk associated with that plant, it would have to be both present in the environment in some sort of a reasonable dispersal distance from the other crop, and it would have to be capable of supporting that pest or pathogen through overwintering. So we need to have both sides of the equation. And the initial review is really built to identify plausible changes associated with a modified plant that might affect either the exposure side of the equation, and here we're really looking at plant occurrence patterns, so that's this first bullet point you see, the distribution, density, or development of the plant, and any sexually compatible relative of the plant that might acquire the trait through outcrossing. Or there would need to be a plausible change in the adverse consequence associated with the plant. And we think about adverse consequences a few different ways. So first, there could be a plausible change in production, creation, or enhancement of a plant pest or a reservoir of a plant pest. Second, there could plausibly be harm to non-target organisms that are beneficial to agriculture. Or third, there could plausibly be harm to agriculture or agriculturally important natural resources. So here's an example of how this type of analysis might work with a modified plant. And if we start here in the upper left-hand side of this chart, we're thinking here about an insect-resistant corn. So this is a hypothetical corn plant, and we're saying here that the requester has modified it in such a way that it's going to express a novel pesticidal protein. So in this case, the requester sends a request to APHIS describing that they have modified corn, describing the genetic change that was made, and describing the trait, phenotype, and mechanism of action of that change. Based on this information, APHIS does an initial review where we're looking for plausible pathways to increased plant pest risk in this modified corn relative to the comparator. And so in this case, we do the initial review and we say, in this example, for this corn, we don't see a plausible way that the occurrence pattern of corn might change due to this novel pesticidal protein that will be expressed. We don't see a way that pest populations or reservoirs of pests could be altered. We also don't see a way that this corn might affect agriculturally important natural resources, but we do see a plausible pathway whereby this modified corn might have a different risk to non-target organisms beneficial to agriculture based on the mechanism of action, so based on the fact that it's now going to be expressing a novel pesticide. And so we've identified one plausible pathway to increase plant pest risk. We write that in a letter back to the requester and send it to them, informing them of the pathway that was identified. And we do this within 180 days of when we received the original complete request describing the corn. Now at this point, once that letter goes back to the requester, the process pauses, and it remains paused until one of two things happened. First, the requester might choose to withdraw the request at this point, or second, the requester could choose to ask APHIS to proceed to the plant pest risk assessment stage. And when they do ask APHIS, because in this example they do, when they ask APHIS to proceed to a PPRA, they also have the option of providing us data that might address the plausible pathway that was identified in the initial review. And during this pause, we really encourage requesters to come in talk to us about whether a data submission might be needed to complete a PPRA, and talk to us about what kind of information they're thinking of submitting so that we can ensure that the data package that we get is something that could address the plausible pathway that was identified. And so in this case, what the requester chose to submit to us was Tier 1 safety testing data for that protein. And I've got an asterisk here with Tier 1 safety testing because people who are familiar with this type of crop might know that APHIS and EPA have released a white paper describing the tiered testing framework. And it's a framework where safety testing is done starting at lower tiers with very high doses of a potential pesticide and highly artificial conditions. And if you're not able to show safety at lower tiers, you would progress into higher tiers with more realistic doses and more realistic conditions for the organism. So this isn't to say that Tier 1 would always be sufficient, and also the requester wouldn't be bound to submit to us in the tiered safety framework. They could submit to us other results that would lead to the same conclusions. But for the purpose of this example, the requester obtained Tier 1 safety data. They looked at it, they said, okay, we think that this addresses